It was recommended to me by a colleague when I first started doing this some time ago that I should always begin with something humorous in the spirit of a joke. So here it goes. If you only give the government a little bit more power, it will finally totally fix everything. My name is Joseph Solis-Mullen. I'm a political scientist and economist at the Libertarian Institute, teach history at Spring Arbor University, and the author and contributor to multiple books, including, apropos to our topic today, The National Debt and You, forthcoming from the Libertarian Institute. I am, as Trevor said, the Libertarian Party's candidate for Senate here in Michigan, and I'm here today to present what I believe is the only real alternative to the failed policies we've seen from both major political parties. As a candidate for the U.S. Senate, I'm offering a perspective you won't hear from either Democrats or Republicans. My approach is firmly rooted in the Austro-Libertarian tradition, a vision of minimal government, maximum personal freedom, and a robust free market economy. Today I want to talk to you about three core areas of policy: monetary, fiscal, and regulatory. These aren't abstract topics. They affect every single one of us, whether it's the dollars in your bank account being devalued by inflation, the taxes that eat away at your paycheck, or the endless regulatory red tape that stifles entrepreneurship and innovation. Now, if we look at the state of these policies under both Democrats and Republicans, what do we find? We see a bipartisan consensus on expanding government power, creating a bloated bureaucracy, and leaving us with a national debt that nearly exceeds $36 trillion. This isn't a coincidence. It's the natural result of a statist mentality. Both parties have bought into the idea that the government should control our economy, regulate our lives, and manipulate our money supply. So let's be clear. My opponents in this race, Representatives Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin, are both part of this problem. Despite the superficial differences between them, they are united in their commitment to the same fundamental idea, that is that the state should have power over our economy and our lives. Today I'm going to outline a different approach. Drawing on the ideas of thinkers like Murray Rothbard, I'll explain how we can turn to sound money, fiscal responsibility, and a system where individuals, not bureaucrats, control their own economic destinies as an antidote to the statist consensus that has for too long dominated and destroyed the lives and livelihoods of the American people. So let's begin with monetary policy, because nothing gets closer to the core of government power than the control over money. The Federal Reserve System, established in 1913, is at the heart of the issue. For over a century, both parties have championed the idea that a group of unelected bureaucrats should have the power to manipulate interest rates, control the money supply, and dictate the value of your savings. And what has this system brought us? Let's look at the history. Since the creation of the Federal Reserve, the purchasing power of the dollar has fallen by more than 96%. This is not an accident. It is the direct result of central banking policies. When the Fed prints money, it devalues the currency. And that means your savings lose value. Think back to the 1920s, the so-called Roaring 20s, a period of economic expansion, but one built on a foundation of easy credit and loose monetary policy. That decade ended in the crash of 1929, leading directly to the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve's manipulation of the money supply and interest rates exacerbated the economic collapse and prolonged the ensuing slump, as well as led to the later recessions of the 1930s, all of which Murray Rothbard outlines in America's Great Depression. But even establishment economists, if you don't take his word for it, establishment economists like former IMF economist and Duke professor Connell Folkamp also admit these same things. And let's not forget the 2008 financial crisis. This was another catastrophe born of the Federal Reserve's easy money policies. Throughout the early 2000s, interest rates were kept artificially low, encouraging risky borrowing and speculative investments in housing. And this is to say nothing of the culture of risk-taking fostered by repeated Fed and Treasury interventions in the preceding decades. When the bubble burst, millions lost their homes, their jobs, and their savings. But typical to a statist economy, who got bailed out? The politically connected, the banks and corporations. The same pattern repeated during the COVID-19 pandemic when trillions of dollars were injected into the economy, further devaluing the currency and leading to the inflation we're still grappling with today. So what's the libertarian alternative? First and foremost, we must end the Fed, a case Rothbard makes in What Has Government Done to Our Money? Central banking is unnecessary, dangerous, and it represents the height of government overreach. The idea that a handful of bureaucrats can determine the interest rate for an entire economy is absurd. In a free market, interest rates would be set by the preferences of individuals, by the supply and demand for savings and investment. By abolishing the Federal Reserve, we would eliminate the root cause of inflation and the prolonged boom-bust cycles, to say nothing of depriving Washington of the ability to play a world empire abroad and welfare state at home. There is simply no way they could convince the American people to pay the taxes necessary to plug the nearly $2 trillion annual deficits the CBO forecasts will now carry on into the 1930s. Of course, with the Fed, there's no need. Just print the money Treasury needs and take it onto your balance sheet as necessary. The best case would be for us to return to sound money, a commodity-based monetary system such as the gold or silver standard, which would prevent the government from inflating the currency to fund wars, welfare programs, or corporate bailouts. Under a gold standard, the government cannot simply print more money. Instead, the value of the currency is tied to a tangible asset, providing a natural check on inflation. If you look at U.S. history, we thrived under a gold standard. Between the end of the Civil War and the creation of the Federal Reserve, the U.S. experienced unprecedented economic growth, low inflation, and rising wages. That's no coincidence. It's what happens when money is stable and government can't manipulate it. Now, some may argue that a gold standard is outdated, that we live in a modern economy that needs, quote, flexibility. But don't be fooled. That just means the ability of big banks and their affiliated investment vehicles, funds, etc., to access money whenever they've gotten themselves over their heads. This cronyism is to the benefit of no one but themselves, and has led to an over-financialized economy whose growth trajectory is far below what would be expected of such a dynamic and mature economy as that of the United States. For those who desire another alternative, could consider competition in currency as a means of self-regulation, such as Hayek's idea, as he presented in Choice in Currency. He proposed that instead of a government monopoly on money, we should allow private currencies to compete. In a free market, if one currency is poorly managed, people will abandon it for a more stable alternative. And this would introduce a market-driven check on inflation and prevent the kind of currency devaluation we've seen under central banking. Another key component, a related component, is free banking, which George Selden has shown in his work on the subject, tend to be more stable and less prone to crises than centralized systems. During the 19th century, Scotland, for example, operated under a free banking system and was highly successful. So to summarize, the libertarian alternative to statist monetary policy is straightforward. End the Fed, return to sound money, allow competing currencies through free banks. These policies would restore stability, protect your savings, and prevent future economic crises. Now let's turn to fiscal policy, which is really about the size and scope of government. And here again, we find both major parties have failed us. Whether it's the Republicans' military spending or the Democrats' welfare programs, their jointly supported entitlement programs, the results have been the same. A federal government that spends far more than it takes in, running deficits year after year, and accumulating a national debt that again is now closing in on $36 trillion. The problem with this approach is twofold. First, deficit spending leads to either higher taxes or inflation. Eventually, the bill comes due. The government either has to raise taxes to pay off the debt, or it has to print more money, which devalues the currency and causes inflation. Both options disproportionately hurt the middle class and the poor. Higher taxes reduce disposable income and discourage investment, while inflation erodes savings and purchasing power. The second problem is that government spending itself distorts the economy. When the government spends money, it is not investing in things that people actually want or need. Instead, it's funding political priorities, often to the benefit of special interests and the politically connected. Whether it's subsidies for large corporations, welfare programs that create dependency and undermine nuclear families, or ludicrously unnecessary military contracts for defense companies, government spending is inherently inefficient and wasteful. The libertarian alternative is a radical reduction in government spending. We need to dramatically shrink the size of the federal government, starting with the military-industrial complex. The U.S. spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. We have military bases in over 70 countries, and we've been engaged in endless wars for decades. This is not only morally wrong, but it's also financially unsustainable. By bringing the troops home, closing foreign military bases, and adopting a foreign policy of non-intervention, we could save hundreds of billions of dollars each year. Next, we need to end all forms of welfare and corporate subsidies. The welfare state is both inefficient and unjust. It creates dependency, discourages work, and traps people in poverty. Libertarians believe that charity should be voluntary, not coerced through taxes. Private charities in local communities are far more effective at helping people than distant bureaucracies. And for those interested, I would recommend seeing David Beto's great work on this unfortunate development. But the problem isn't just with welfare for individuals. Arguably, an even bigger problem is welfare for corporations. From farm subsidies to energy subsidies, tariffs, price supports, monopolies, the government is constantly propping up big business at the expense of the taxpayer, to the tune of nearly $100 billion annually. A key principle of libertarian fiscal policy is the balanced budget. Running deficits is irresponsible and immoral. It shifts the burden of debt onto future generations. By slashing spending and adopting a balanced budget, we could avoid the inflationary consequences of deficit spending and ensure that the government operates within its means. And in the absence of the Federal Reserve, a measure of accountability could be returned to Congress, as its members would be forced to actually pay immediately by taxing their constituents for what is to be provisioned by the state. I suspect that alone would shrink government considerably overnight. I would be remiss here to not point out that between Slotkin and Rogers, who between the two of them have served nearly 2 decades on the Hill from 2000 to the present, neither has ever helped produce a balanced budget or done anything but sign continuing resolutions and omnibuses that keep funding the government, even though the debt has exploded under their watch from $5.6 trillion in 2000 to over $30 trillion today. But back to our politicians and their inability to fund their lavish statist programs by actually levying the necessary taxes upon Americans. Such lower taxes would be welcome, for high taxes on their own discourage investment, stifle entrepreneurship by creating barriers to entry, and reduce economic growth in a number of ways. By eliminating unnecessary government programs, departments, agencies, we could eliminate the income tax entirely. Imagine a world where you keep 100% of what you earn, where you decide how to spend your money, not the government. That's the libertarian vision. It is also, prior to 1913, how Americans were living. And critically, for those who are interested, the introduction of the income tax was sold to the public when it was voted on as a way to, quote, tax the rich. And you see how that turned out. You might call that story every government program and policy ever. But I digress. In summary, libertarian fiscal policy is about reducing the size of government, ending deficit spending, and allowing individuals to keep their hard-earned money. Of course, in the perfect anarcho-capitalist vision of society, we'd keep all of your money and everything would be privately provisioned. The third and final area I want to discuss with my time today is regulatory policy. Just like with monetary and fiscal policy, the two major parties have been complicit in creating a sprawling regulatory state that stifles innovation, burdens small businesses, and infringes on individual liberty. Let's be clear, the regulatory state is out of control. According to estimates, the cost of federal regulations to the U.S. economy is around $2 trillion each year. That's more than 10% of GDP, an enormous burden on entrepreneurs, small businesses, and workers. Regulatory compliance costs are especially harmful to small businesses, which don't have the resources to navigate the endless maze of rules, regulations, and mandates. This creates an unfair playing field where large corporations, which can afford teams of lawyers and lobbyists, benefit at the expense of smaller competitors. The growth of the regulatory state has accelerated under both Republicans and Democratic administrations. The Dodd-Frank Act, which passed in response to the 2008 financial crisis, was supposed to rein in Wall Street, but instead it created even more red tape for small and medium-sized banks. Meanwhile, the Affordable Health Care Act imposed costly mandates on businesses, making it harder for them to hire workers and expand. And let's not forget the environmental regulations that have crippled entire industries, from coal mining to oil drilling, all in the name of fighting climate change, which, if it is a problem, is more likely to be solved by entrepreneurial creativity than government meddling. The libertarian alternative is simple: deregulation. The government has no business interfering in the private sector. Markets are self-regulated. In a truly free market, businesses that harm consumers or engage in fraud will be held accountable by competition, private arbitration, and the legal system. There is no need for a massive bureaucracy to oversee every aspect of economic life. Deregulation would unleash a wave of innovation and economic growth. Imagine if entrepreneurs were free to experiment, free to bring new products to market, and free to compete without government interference. Of course, some will argue that without regulation, businesses will harm consumers, destroy the environment, or create dangerous products. But these concerns are completely misguided and overblown. Businesses that harm their consumers don't survive in a competitive marketplace. If a company pollutes the environment, it will be held accountable through tort law and the market's response. If a company produces dangerous products, consumers will turn to competitors who offer safer alternatives. The exception to this is if there is an interventionist state that can be captured by that corporate entity through a combination of legalized bribery, i.e. lobbying, and regulatory capture, whereby a corporatist fusion between state and business creates a revolving door between the two to the benefit of them at the expense of us. The truth is that most regulations are not about protecting consumers or the environment. They're about protecting special interests. Large corporations often lobby for regulations that stifle competition. For example, the pharmaceutical industry lobbies for complex FDA approval processes that make it difficult for smaller companies to bring new drugs to market, and this drives up costs and limits innovation. The libertarian approach, again, is clear. Eliminate unnecessary regulations, end the system of crony capitalism, and allow free markets to regulate themselves. And by doing so, we can unleash the full potential of the American economy. In conclusion, the libertarian alternative to the status quo is one of personal freedom, fiscal responsibility, and sound money. By ending the Federal Reserve, returning to a system of sound money, drastically reducing government spending, and eliminating burdensome regulations, we can bring about the kind of individual liberty and prosperity unknown to virtually every American today living. The path forward is clear, but it requires a willingness to challenge the bipartisan consensus in Washington. It requires a recognition that government is the problem, not the solution. It requires faith in the power of free individuals to organize and cooperate without the heavy hand of the state. It requires rejecting the establishment. As for my opponents, Mike Rogers, apart from being a former Fed and longtime congressman who got us into this mess, he also sits on the board of the Atlantic Council, and there is nothing more establishment than that. And Slotkin is so representative of the bipartisan consensus of continuing to do the same stupid things over and over that Liz Cheney reached across the aisle to endorse her. To those of you who are tired of the endless wars, the skyrocketing debt, the creeping inflation, the suffocating regulations, I say, there is another way. Libertarianism offers a path toward peace, prosperity, and freedom, and with your support, we can bring about real change in Washington. Thank you all for your time. Anyone have any questions?
With sound money being backed by something, how do you feel about just cryptocurrency in general? And is that a way to go about this in the future, or should it be backed by like hard something, gold, diamonds, commodities like that?
My preference would be, it would depend on what kind of cryptocurrency you're talking about. Something with an unlimited supply in the hands of the government would be no different than what we have now. Something like Bitcoin, for example, something that has a hard cap or that's even actually deflationary in the long run, could be acceptable, certainly. I wouldn't mind, as I said, like a competing basket, a market of currencies, where if you had one of the provisioners, one of the producers of the currency starting to deliberately erode the value of the currency, that way market participants would be free to exit that currency. But what we have instead are legal tender laws that say that this piece of paper printed by the government must be accepted, whatever you say about it. And that to me is unjust and a huge part of the problem. So ending legal tender laws would be a huge step in the right direction.
What should be the basis of the monetary supply? In other words, the M1 paper supply that's out there. What should dictate that quantity?
Are we talking about right now, like in the current system?
Theoretically.
Theoretically.
What should dictate that?
Well,
right now, credit is based on basically credit.
Right. The credit is built on credit right now. That's the complex thing about talking about our system today, is that essentially banks create the money themselves, right? Yeah. Most of the money in our system is created by the lenders themselves. So as far as how the government creates money, because again, if you had a bank that issued its own paper, again, under a free banking system, they could originate their own paper and they could back that with the value of assets. For example, asset-backed paper. That's pretty commonly issued. You could do that for the government. For the government, if we have a government and they are issuing currency, it would be my preference that it is backed either explicitly one-to-one with tax receipts, number two, or with a precious metal. One of the two things.
Okay,
so that they cannot
physical commodity or precious metal.
Something that the government cannot interfere with. Because the problem, again, is that the government can change the quantity of money almost at will. And if you view money as a contract, the deliberate dilution of your holdings is a violation of that contract. And so we want the government not to be able to engage in that practice.
Now, isn't it the Federal Reserve that actually creates the money and loans it to the government? We did, through Campaign for Liberty, we got this through Congress 3 times, finally through the Senate, and they did a report on it, the Government Accounting Office. Came back, gave a report to the U.S. Congress in 2011, and it says that the Federal Reserve created roughly $16 trillion without Congress even knowing about it. So this at a time they were loaning about $1 trillion a year to the federal government. That's just over 27 months. So you figure the government was responsible for about $2 trillion or thereabouts, while the Federal Reserve was responsible for about $16 trillion of essentially invisible money that we didn't even see. I think $5 trillion with the foreign banks and whatnot, and this is still going on. So it's
Dollar swap lines.
it's worse than you think. It's not government. It's these private bankers that run the government.
Which is part of the Federal Reserve System, right? Like these large banks are actually required by law to submit bids to the Treasury auctions that they're taking part in.
It's a big scam.
It is, and when you talk about the money going overseas, it's because you have lenders, and I touched on this, you have associated banks and investment vehicles, offshore investment vehicles, who are trading in dollars, right? And if you are a foreign bank and there's a sudden change in the interest rates, right? All of a sudden servicing any dollar calls that you get becomes extremely expensive. And so what the Federal Reserve started doing in the wake of 2007, 2008 is they opened up what are called dollar swap lines with foreign lenders. And there's a whole bunch of them, and they have to issue it in their annual report to list all the different other central banks that they supply dollar liquidity to. So there are tons of dollars flying out the door to them, to our own private banks. As far as the government's money, as far as the government's
follow this stuff. It's just like they just do what they want, you know.
Well, in terms of the government's money, one critical thing that we should point out is the Fed can't tell the Treasury no. The Treasury says the Congress passes whatever budget they pass. And then the Federal Reserve essentially issues the money for the bonds.
Yeah, that was part of the New Deal, 1933, I think it was.
What the Federal Reserve can control is the cost of the money. And that is why interest service on the debt in the last year and a half has skyrocketed. Is because now, instead of basically being able to borrow for free, which is what the federal government was able to do for a very long time in the wake of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, now they're having to pay something closer to what the market would probably dictate, although that's not even quite right. We don't know what the market would actually price U.S. debt as if you didn't have the Federal Reserve there. But so the Federal Reserve is able, with its manipulation of the interest rates, to control how much the government has to pay for the money. But in terms of actually issuing the money, whatever Congress passes, whatever the Treasury wants,
the
Fed
unlimited checking account, essentially the part of the deal that FDR made, they can borrow all the money they want. It's got an unlimited checkbook with the Federal Reserve. But the Federal Reserve bankers, they create money outside of what the federal government even knows about. And in the case of that 27 months, it was roughly 8 times as much money created by the private bankers, up and above what they were loaning to the government. It's a huge game. It's just it's off the page.
I've got a question kind of piggybacking onto that is I think the Federal Reserve just lowered interest rates. What do you see kind of going on with that, and how do you expect that to continue going through kind of the election season and onward from there? Do you have any predictions or observations about that?
let's call them observations. That way I don't have to make so many caveats. Yes, I did write something about this fairly recently. So there are a couple of things going on here. Number one, it's an election year, and it's a pretty safe bet. It's not every time, but something like 60% of the time they usually cut rates in the run-up. The second thing is that there are a lot of really distressed bank bond portfolios because rates and bond prices move inversely. And so when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates dramatically, you have to think we were sitting around 1%, then they went up over 5%. That's a 500% increase. That's again, 1 to 5 just sounds like, oh, that's not very much, but like in the bond market world, that's huge, especially in the government bond market world. So, and of course, the government bonds are sort of the underlying quote-unquote safe asset that the whole global financial system uses as sort of their benchmark. And so these bonds essentially all went deep into the red. This is what happened to Silicon Valley Bank, SVB. Do you guys remember that bank going down? Essentially, they had a bunch of bonds that suddenly just went hugely into the red. And they were not able to get liquid enough to cover their expenses because all of a sudden the value that they could get for these bonds, if they had to turn around and sell them, would be nothing. So on the one hand, you have seriously distressed bank bond portfolios that they would like to start reversing that. It being an election year. Number three, I should say, is the interest cost on the debt. Jerome Powell has made several statements about, well, whatever they pass is not our business. We're not going to get involved in that. We're not going to help them out. But realistically, interest rates can't stay this high, or will be at $50 trillion in debt, by like 2031 or something like that.
Every 100 days.
Yeah, and that what's scary about that conversation is that it doesn't even account for all the money that the government has already promised to pay people. If you include all of the so-called unfunded entitlements, things like Social Security, that they're already promising to pay by 2050, we're looking at something like $180 trillion in additional commitments, in additional debt. And again, you don't need to be an economist to understand that without, I don't even think you could raise that. In taxes, you couldn't do that politically. No politician is going to vote for those kind of tax increases. Although I did notice Mitch McConnell did say the other day he would support raising taxes to fund more nuclear weapons building to confront China. So there's always that. And then again, so you're left with what? That's why the government loves the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has many other functions. It serves a lot of other interests, but it serves the government. And the government loves the Federal Reserve because they don't actually have to pay for anything. They can just turn on the money printer. And they bring in tax receipts to keep the bond market happy. Because it's not as though the government could just cut all taxes. Donald Trump mentioned, eliminating all the taxes and funding the government with tariffs. Yes, I would love that. If the government shrunk down small enough that it could be funded by such a mechanism. But that's not what would happen. What would happen is something like what happened to the British bond market when Liz Truss a couple of years ago became like the fastest prime minister to rise and fall ever, when she said, hey, bond market, what do you think about us cutting a bunch more taxes and diminishing our revenue? And the bond market freaked out. That's something that could happen to us.
Are you familiar with the work of Mark Skidmore over there at Michigan State? He's done some research on some of the money that's been essentially missing from the Federal Reserve. We can go back to the day before the 9/11 events, 9/10/01, when Rumsfeld got up there and says he's got a war against I guess it was the Pentagon. $2.3 trillion missing. Big chunk of money. Anyway, so next day, this big old thing, 9/11 happens, events, and everybody forgets about it, right? And, but anyway, so he's been following that, and they got up to like $21 trillion over 10 years. And then, of course, the way the government is, they come down on this guy just a nutcase, and he's, but he's head of his department over there. But he had done a snapshot. So it's just like, well, there it is, and so they didn't plan on that apparently. So anyway, as the time goes on, I guess they got Congress to actually vote so that they don't even report this stuff anymore. So $21 trillion missing over 10 years, and now it could be worse than that because they don't even report it. I mean, this is, it's a government gone rogue. It's gone.
Yeah, I mean, if it were up to
I ran against warmonger Mike Rogers in 2012. He never got on the stage with me, and he never ran again after that.
I mean, if it were up to me, we would probably bulldoze the Pentagon. What on earth do we have a standing army for anyway? Who's going to invade the United States? We have a massive Navy. We could keep the Navy. Sure, why not? We have a little Navy, a little Air Force. Why not? Why on earth are we spending $1 trillion a year now on the military? And actually, if you read the Washington Post this last week, we're actually we're on the cheap. We're on the cheap, according to the experts at the Pentagon. We actually need to up our spending because our force posture, quote unquote, is not sufficient to fight the multi-theater wars they envision being necessary for the future. Which is just incredible. Spending 10 times more than everyone else, but somehow we're so in danger that we need to spend more. This is completely insane, but it's never going to stop. It's just going to keep happening unless you get rid of these things. I love reading in the paper that it's highly classified. Highly classified. We can't know about it. We're just supposed to trust them. And we're also supposed to believe simultaneously that voting really, really matters because we govern ourselves. But of course, anything that's important we can't actually know about. Go figure. Again, this all goes back to FDR and Truman and Eisenhower and the creation of a national security bureaucracy. Yeah.
Do you have an actual program to off-ramp or end the Federal Reserve System?
I mean, its charter would need to be revoked by Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, so if any of us ever got elected, we would literally be sitting alone at the lunch table. It would never happen. The only thing that is going to end this, I often reflect back on this comment a fellow made. He was asked, why did the British leave India? And he said, because they were broke. They would have stayed forever. And that's essentially how I view the American Empire. Eventually, they'll just have to quit because they'll be broke. And that's it. And hopefully they don't kill us all before then.
Yeah, nuclear war is pretty much waving over our heads right now.
Yeah, David Sanger in the I think it was the Post again, just a couple of weeks ago, said that the Pentagon is saying that they need to quote unquote adjust their doctrine, which whatever that means. I mean, we've never renounced first use, so I don't even know what that could mean. We've already, but you know, you've seen what's happened. The Chinese have moved from the quote-unquote minimal deterrence that they had for a very long time, which was just a couple of hundred nukes. Now, since 2016, 2017, they've been laying the groundwork. Before that, they're working on things that we don't even have at this point, at least not that we know of. Multiple reentry vehicles, hypersonics, things that make our lives potentially very dangerous. But nothing our government is doing is offering any benefits for this danger.
Yeah, one more question, sort of change subject. Of course, libertarians believe in abolishing all sort of regulations on the economy. Do you have sort of a top 3 sectors of the economy that you would look at deregulating first?
Well, we have to fix the money in banking first, because those are the arteries of the capitalist system, and ours are completely corrupted. So you'd have to end the Federal Reserve, deregulate banks. There would probably be a period of great tumult as things were hashed out. But again, we didn't get into this mess yesterday, so it shouldn't be expected that there will be some quick, easy fix. It will take time for things to sort out. It takes time for information to travel around the marketplace and for new equilibrium to be established. Other areas of the economy. Probably the energy industry, and then also trade. Trade would need to be deregulated. We have so much interference in the economy, especially, and this is again something that's so unpopular that you could never politically do this. You could never tell the farmers, like, we're going to end your subsidies. Goodbye, right? Like, you're never going to
happen.
Like it does need to happen. But it's much easier to just tell people, don't worry, we're going to just turn on the money burner and make sure you get paid and you get paid and you get paid and you get paid. And we'll just keep going as long as it goes. I mean, it's no coincidence that the fights to get balanced budgets in the 1990s were incredibly fraught. But it is worth remembering that Clinton and Gingrich both paid a political cost for doing it. They actually created a balanced budget. No, it would not have solved all our problems, but it is worth noting that had that budget been kept to, we would have been on track to pay off what we had owed by that point by about 2010. And instead we went completely in the opposite direction. So,
My question is kind of the inverse of his, is there ever a time when federal regulation in the economic markets is justified? And if so, under what conditions or what parameters would that be? If you had a magic wand and could eliminate them all?
I would say never, because if you allow them even the slightest inch, eventually over time that door will be pushed open all the way. And I would just refer you back to the early debates about the Commerce Clause, which now has been used to justify virtually any federal interference in the market at all. And again, it was supposed to be this deliberate little, well, what if this one tiny little thing pops up? Well, then it would probably be okay, but that's probably not going to happen, so don't worry about it. And now look where we are. You simply can't allow the state any room. The state is a thing of power, and power wants only more power. So, yeah.
Do you think the United States should be part of any multinational trade organizations or not?
Talking shops are fine. Talking shops are fine. Things like the Gap, where people just kind of get together and bounce ideas off each other. But the problem is when that turns into kind of a, like you said, a multilateral, globally expansive, like if you're going to do anything like that, it has to be on really a bilateral basis. Because there is no like one size fits all. What you wind up with is just this sprawling,
Well, I'm talking about
institution.
a free trade zone where it's basically tariff-free amongst all those part of that.
Sure, but the problem with that is there has never been a free trade zone. You could, if you were to have a free trade zone, you could literally on one small piece of paper, you could write, okay, no tariffs, no subsidies, no quotas, and if you sign this, you're in. No one would ever sign that. No government has ever agreed to that ever, and they wouldn't. Our own period of so-called free trade was a series of asymmetric trade deals that were designed to give Washington sort of the military prerogatives and security prerogatives that they wanted elsewhere. Japan is a great case in point. The trade concessions that were made were entirely asymmetrical. It was opening up the American market to Japanese competition in exchange for Japan helping to put the cost of the military bases, keeping the population where the military bases were as quiescent as possible, because you can imagine they're not popular, they're still not popular. If you look at China, the trade concessions to China were entirely asymmetrical, but again, it was with an agenda, it was a security agenda. The idea was that if we transform China into a sort of middle-class capitalist democracy, then they'll just do whatever we want. And again, I've talked about this in other speeches, but it was all part of this idea of development theory. That everything that happened in the West is translatable to every other society everywhere, and it is a totally materialistic, natural process that no one can stop. And so again, these misguided ideas have done horrible things to the U.S. economy over time. And so I'd be very leery of entering into any kind of multilateral agreement like that, because you have to make all these little asides for everyone. And I just think if the United States were to engage in any kind of deals like that, they should be bilateral and very carefully calibrated to the needs of both sides.
So in other words, bilateral, every other trading entity or country or sovereign.
I think it would be far preferable to what we have at this point. It's certainly not
I think
ideal.
that'd be higher cost for the U.S. consumer.
Well, it depends. It really depends on what the nature of the agreements were. I mean, I don't think that we're getting the lowest possible cost under the arrangements that we have now. So I certainly don't think we should continue going in the direction that we are going, which is towards more protection.
No, that's.
Yeah, we obviously should not be doing that, but that has become the vogue. And, even though, and this is one of the crazy things about Donald Trump, is he came in with all these very populist, protectionist measures, and the Biden team was just sitting on the sidelines while Trump was in office saying, oh, these are dumb ideas, he doesn't know how the economy works. And then they get in office, and the policies just stay the same. It's just like he ripped up the Iran nuclear deal. And all the Obama guys who said, oh, that's such a dumb move, oh, terrible, Donald Trump's such an idiot. Then they come in with Joe Biden, do they get back in the deal? No, of course they don't. And so it's very hard to be optimistic about the way forward because we are moving towards more protection, towards more confrontation, towards intensifying the power of an already extremely powerful state. So.
Are you able to get into any debates with some of these other candidates? This is CIA and Mr. FBI.
No. Are they having a debate in Trevor's City? Last I heard it was off.
I don't know, but you know, they're pretty despicable characters, and we should get a number of votes just by default. So I put this thing together. I mean, for a potential sign here, it says, "Don't trust the CIA or the FBI." And put a question mark there. Vote for our guy, Libertarian. Was it Joseph Solis-Mullen, U.S. Senate? So if we could get some signs up like that, I would get some votes just by default.
Yeah,
Like most of the voters, you know, you gotta keep it simple, man.
Yes, I certainly think that the bad actions of our government have become so blatant, and the media space has become so democratized. If you think about, you know, when my grandparents were, you know, watching TV, like there were like 3 stations, and they all basically said the same thing. If you picked up your newspaper, they all basically said the same thing. Like maybe you could subscribe to like a newsletter that someone printed out. It was the control that the government had over the narrative was so strong, so powerful. Today, though, they're just not able to control the narrative the way that they would like. So many of their bad actions have been exposed that people are starting, even, you know, more mainstream voices, even, you know, members of Congress are calling into question, you know, the legitimacy of the FBI. Granted, this is because of the lawfare campaign that was conducted against their candidate. It's not as though the FBI was some beacon of, you know, good action before and like just recently turned bad. You know,
There's plenty of, you know, negative campaigning going on. Here's one that's kind of anti-Slotkin. This is something that just came in the mail last 2 days. I get stuff for Bolden. Of course, these people have probably 20 million plus to spend for a U.S. Senate seat, and you know, so you're looking at, you know, if you don't get on the stage, you know, I mean, obviously, anybody I talk to, they just don't know who you are. They have a clue, you know, but they know who Slotkin is, and they go who Rogers is, and you know, they're either one way or the other, pretty much, you know, because they don't want the other one to have it. It's all negative, you know. It's just like, oh, anybody but former CIA, and the other one's
nothing
well,
either.
anybody but warmonger Mike Rogers, you know.
I mean,
But there's a lot of negative campaigning on there, and if we just let them know there was a third choice, you didn't necessarily have to go with the CIA or the FBI, because I don't think anybody trusts either one of them. I mean,
lesser of 2 people's voting is not good, but it is extremely powerful. I remember back in 2016 when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were running, and virtually anyone you talked to said, I hate them both. I just can't stand them. And they said, that Gary Johnson fellow seems pretty nice, but I'm not going to vote for him because he can't win. And I hate this person more than that person, so I'm going to vote for that person.
you talking about Ron Paul? Not vote for Ron Paul because he can't win? I heard that.
2012, 2016, it's been the same thing for some time. And you know, it's hard to be optimistic given that the system is first past the post.
We came this close to winning Washington State, no way.
I mean, money is a very, very powerful political weapon in our society. I mean, you can predict most races just by who raises the most money.
I have a question for you that's a little, you know, changing what we're talking about here, but just thinking about the incentives, like here in Michigan for like the Whitmer administration, and like after 2020 and the pandemic, there was all this pandemic money floating around, and it essentially didn't go to any of the companies in Michigan that were affected the most. It went to government agencies and, you know, publicly funded projects, roads and parks and things, but it didn't go to any small businesses, it didn't go back to the people, it went to multinational corporations buying huge chunks of land with no property taxes. What do you think that incentive is? What makes them do that versus help the people in Michigan that are the voters?
Because, well, she was helping some voters. You see, she's a Democrat. One of my first political science classes, my professor got up and he said, who does Barack, mind you, I was in school in like 2007, 2008, 2009, right around that time. He said, who does Barack Obama want to tax? And, we'd all been, propagandized appropriately by the news cycle, and we all said the rich. And he said, he'd like to tax only Republicans. And so when you ask, why did Gretchen Whitmer only give money to the government agencies? Why did she give them to multinational corporations? Why didn't she give them to small business owners? It's because small business owners vote overwhelmingly Republican. It's because government employees vote overwhelmingly Democrat. And so it's literally just interest group politics. It's the old patronage network. It's just a little harder to see nowadays. Back in the day, they'd roll the truck into your district and they'd start unloading Christmas turkeys. And it was like, okay. So, but now it's invisible. It's going behind the scenes. Yeah.
So why don't Republicans stand up for the small businessmen that are their constituency? They haven't done a very good job of it either.
They have not done a good job. They have not done a good job. But again, you don't need to do a good job. You just need to do a better job. And they do a better job. They fight for tax cuts. They fight for deregulation on some issues. And again, you don't have to do a great job. You just have to do a better job than the Democrats, who don't actually care about small business owners. And again, it's just lesser of two evils voting. So if the Democrats are not your party and the Republicans are doing some things for you, by default, you just vote for the Republicans.
Sounds like a broken system.
It is a very broken system, and it's very much showing, right? Like, no one looks around, the American scene and thinks like, wow, this is a very well-governed society. This is all going very well. It's not, and people understand that. The fact that we are having the problems that we are, given our natural abundance of resources and manpower and geography, it can only be bad governance. There's no other explanation for it. We are the most providentially provisioned state in the history of the world and that will ever be. And yet we are having these struggles because of bad government. A perfect example of this, if you really need to see it, is Argentina. Argentina, for many years, was just a wreck. Why? On paper, they're the second richest country in South America. It was because of bad government. Bad government. So, got to get rid of the bad government. But sometimes it takes things getting really, 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 really bad, which it did get really, really bad in Argentina. Maybe it's just not bad enough here yet. So,
yeah, real fast.
In an ideal world, what should a Senate campaign look like? What kind of issues should they be talking at the Senate level? Absent the current events, we're talking from a philosophical level, what would you like to see as a healthy Senate debate between ideological adversaries or what have you?
you're saying absent current events?
Yeah, so just philosophically, what do you think a Senate campaign should be about?
Well,
What topics such as foreign policy,
well, there's always
engineering.
commerce, whatever.
What are they splitting at?
I guess because the Senate is supposed to be the deliberative body, the debating club,
And the
right?
representative of the state in that federal debate, right?
I would say that their debate, because there are always going to be ideological differences, but there should be one place where they agree, and that is that they should have the power, not an imperial presidency. And Congress has forked over so much of its delegated constitutional authority to the president, to the courts, to the permanent bureaucracy, that it serves no real function at all. And so that, I think, would be the ideal debate, because even if you have disagreements about the vision of the future of a society, which Conflict of Visions, which I read some years ago, I recommend reading that if you haven't. It does pose the question of whether or not there are just two really fundamentally different ways of looking at society, and maybe there will always be conflict between them. You're always trying to come to some kind of marriage between the two, some kind of moderate compromise between the two, which would be fine, as long as that's what was happening in an open, deliberative body, where things were paid for promptly on the spot, via taxation from the representatives, who then had to go back to their constituents and explain why this happened. Instead, that's not what they do. They just come back and say, hey, guess what? I got a bunch of jobs for our district or brought back some money to this district, and nope, no new taxes or anything like that. Don't worry about it, you know? That should be the crux of all debate, is taking power back. Taking constitutionally delegated authority back from all these other places that they put it. But even as I say that, it should be clear why they wouldn't do that, right? Because who wants to be accountable for that stuff? Just think about it. Right now, their job is just give out free stuff and go chill in Congress and collect a really nice salary. And after that, you can roll into some lobbying job or sit on the board of someplace. Who wants the actual difficulty of making hard votes and taxing people and making cuts? That is more likely than anything to just make people mad and maybe have them throw you out of office. And who wants that? Much easier to not have the responsibilities. So even as I say it, like that is what it should be. How do we take back these things that we're supposed to be doing? That just will not happen.
Are you familiar with some of the hearings that Senator Ron Johnson is doing on the COVID? Basically, it's a scam. So I just call it the COVID scam or the scamdemic, whatever. But anyway, trying to get to the bottom of that, and obviously more harm has been done probably than any other scam in history. So I think that's something to maybe follow up on. And I don't see either one of these other candidates touching that subject. But yeah, the Ron Johnson, just listen to some of his hearings there. Del Bigtree does this show every week. It's called The High Wire, and he has some of the best scientists and doctors in the world. They're basically blacklisted from corporate media. McCullough is the most published heart doctor in the world, and he can't get on corporate media. So he comes to the High Wire, and this is stuff you should look into. But these are things that a lot of people are concerned about, that the Democrat and the Republican won't touch. And if you can just, and it's just one little subject there, or geoengineering. I mean, they're spraying shit on us, and these guys won't touch that subject. Actually, you go down to Tennessee, and actually the state legislature passed a law that says, basically stop spraying stuff on us. So this is real.
Yeah,
and there's more than enough people that it's real that they would take a vote away from Mrs. FBI or Mrs. CIA or Mr. FBI.
It's really, again, it's about getting that messaging out there.
Well, you just all you really need is one or two, I'm against the geoengineering, or we're going to stop the geoengineering. That's something we could do.
Right, it's getting that message.
Or we're going to find out, we're going to prosecute those responsible for.
Because you were holding up that mailer right there. You've been getting those mailers for months.
Oh God, they're
you get them every day.
multiple.
Andrew, how much a pack of mailers cost?
Not cheap.
Not cheap. Not cheap. Money plays. Money plays.
Oh yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. What are we out in Washington
It's not
State?
about being right. That was one of the really disillusioning things for me. Being an academic, I thought we were like pursuing truth or something like that. That's incorrect. Saying something like that will actually get you laughed at because it's all about perspective, and perspective is about power. It's about creating a hegemonic paradigm that excludes people who don't think like you. And so, yes, we could say all the correct things, but it's not going to matter unless we can get several million people to see that and get a chance to repeatedly tell them it over and over and over, because you need to flood the media space.
But there are people in these groups. If you go to geoengineering, then there's a compassionate group that will get you votes. If you go through the COVID, putting Dr. Fauci behind bars or something along those lines, then there's a following there. There's enough people. We started. They got a ton of people. Actually, there was a study they did out in Seattle where they got 98% of the people to get one or more COVID shots. That's where Bill Gates and MSNBC and all talk in it. And so then they got a 1,236% increase in heart attacks. So it's like, I think they're connected. So that but hey, bottom line is now they're like on a 10 COVID shot, and I hear this crap on the radio still. They're trying to talk, of course it's sponsored by Pfizer. They'll try to talk people into get like a 10th shot, and it's just like, if you don't know by now, But the bottom line is only 1 in 10 people actually get it. So people are they're informed, they're not doing anything.
I certainly think that there are opportunities for issue coalition building. This is something that the party has talked about at the national level. I think there is one thing that we need to be absolutely clear about, and that is that there are very few people who are not interested in statism. Like, I think we just need to come to Jesus about that, if we haven't already. There are very few actual libertarians. It's not a question of most people are libertarians at heart, they just don't know it yet. That's just not true. Most people are not libertarians.
I don't think
They would
anybody wants to get
like the
shot
state.
anymore. Yeah.
They would like the state to govern them. They just have a favorite team that they would like to rule them. And if they didn't, we wouldn't have the system that we have now, but we do. In a totally free media space. Nothing's stopping people from looking up any of the things you're talking about. They're not. They don't care.
There's 1 in 10 people
They're
getting shot now. They're not getting it
There
anymore.
may be a
So
few
they
people.
know, they just don't want you, they don't want to express what, they don't want to lose their job or something. Basically, most people won't stand up for, but they know that these shots don't work. 9 out of 10 people know those shots don't work, and they pretty much know it's a scam. And yet, if you could take on an issue like that, I think it would get a lot of votes.
As I said,
And that's just
I'm not a believer that it is about being correct on any given issue.
Pardon?
Donald Trump is wrong about 90% of the things he says. Kamala Harris is wrong about 90% of the things she says. Does that matter? No, because it's not about being right. It's really not. We don't live in a republic of virtue in the Aristotelian sense that knowledge is the ultimate aim of human existence.
It's what it's what the people think, okay? And if you go back to Dick Cheney, it's the truth doesn't matter. It's whatever the hell they can get you to believe. So yeah, they did that prior to 9/11 events, and they were able to sell that scam. But in any case, the people are on to this COVID thing, and if you were to address that, you would be someone that people would pay attention to.
Good question.
Yeah.
Being running at the Senate level, the thing that's come up several times is money, power, network. So in the whole state of Michigan, there are no libertarians that hold any kind of power and money or network. Is that pretty, that's pretty much what I'm hearing.
That is fairly accurate. It's something that I had a discussion with one of my colleagues about, because he said, gosh, it would seem like we are the natural party where like big businesses and high net worth individuals would gravitate to because we don't want to tax them and stuff. And I said, well, look, even better than not being taxed is to be able to use the state to get you rents. And thus has it always been. What the Republicans and Democrats are offering is rents. They're offering to give people money in perpetuity. And so that's why we are not able to attract, large high net worth individuals, large organizations, corporations, because we're not offering to trade influence for their money. And that's a very difficult thing. Again, it's a very disillusioning, very disheartening thing. I do think our natural constituency is probably small business owners, who can just afford to make, small grassroots level donations, who might be willing to run at the local level, people who have roots in a community, who have the trust of the local community, because local races, are winnable. It's not just about money in the local race. A Senate race is about the money. A governor's race is about the money. A presidential race is about the money. Yes, there are structural components to the system, things like first past the poll voting, things like the monopolization of the two parties on the debates, but more than anything, it's about being able to stuff mailboxes with tons and tons of mailers. I'll give you an example. Mike Bloomberg, you may remember, he took some of his billions and was going to run for president, right? And he stuffed so many mailers in our mailboxes, ran so many YouTube ads that my 5-year-old one day was like, Dad, who are you going to vote for? I said, not hot on anybody. He said, well, you should vote for Mike, because Mike will get it done. And not to infantilize American voters, but there is a reason that they saturate the media space with it. Is when you turn on the football game, it's political ad. Like, they don't spend all this money because it doesn't work. It does work. And so, yeah, it's a real challenge. But I've been consistent I only did this because I thought that it was important at the top of the ticket to message appropriately, to be a good representative of what our party ideologically stands for, but that really our primary focus should be on winning local races, where you actually have a chance to win, where you can actually make some changes. And again, you know, like looking further down the road, if you're able to win some local offices, you know, build the trust in the community, show that the policies work, you can then from there, you know, build out little hubs of support, which there's, you know, campaign volunteers, there's potential donation volunteer, you know, potential donor bases, and that's really the best I can offer, so. Yeah. Thank you all for having me.